Welcome and greetings from the University of Connecticut and from the United States. This is quite the honor to have this opportunity to address you. It's quite of a different kind of experience to present a keynote through the context of video, but I think it'll be kind of fun to see how you can take the content and work with it. First, before I begin, I'd like to thank Ian and Brian and Judy and our local person here, Matt, who's made this kind of video presentation possible. It's quite a number of people who need to get together to try to pull this off, and I appreciate all their support in making this work. I also wanted to, before I start, indicate to you that you can get access to much of the content that I want to describe for you, as well as the PowerPoints and some of the supporting materials if you go to pbis.org and also to cber.org, that's cber.org. Both of those sites have libraries where we store our presentations, and you're more than welcome to go there and look at the presentation as well as get access to some of the materials. So given that little startup point, I also mentioned to you that there'll be some handouts that Ian and others have for you, and you can pick those up if you'd like, but they're available online. So let's get started. I'm going to talk at you for about 30 minutes or so. I've got some material that I want to try to share with you to communicate some big ideas around what is positive behavioral support. And at the end, I've got 3 questions that I've been asked to respond to. And in all, it'll take about 35 or 40 minutes. So we'll see how this works. First, I want to indicate to you that really the purpose of this presentation, or what Ian and Brian asked me to do, is to describe a little bit about what is school-wide positive behavioral support and what are the main principles and characteristics that define what we do. So I'm going to focus on that particular topic as we go through the content. Now, what I'd like to do to get started is to give you an example of one school, just to show you what it means to address the issues around discipline and behavior inside our schools. This is a school that's grades are years 7 through 12, what we call intermediate and high school here in the States, and they had 880 students in this particular school. In one school year, they had 5,100 office discipline referrals, and that's 5,100 times a student was written up for violating a local school rule or standard. Nearly 2/3 of those 800 kids had made at least one trip to the office. And that's a lot of disciplinary action going on inside this school. And that's an important context for us to think about, because the work that I do in the world of behavioral support tries to address the challenges associated with that particular problem. Let me show you another way to think about those 5,100 referrals. And let's just assume that it takes an administrator or a school principal or a schoolmaster 15 minutes to process each one of those events. That's equal to 76,000 minutes in a school year that was spent handling problem behavior inside the school. Let's assume then again also that there is a 6 to 8 hour school day. If you equate that to the amount of time spent processing referrals, that's 159 days of time that the administration spent processing office discipline referrals inside this school. That is a significant amount of instructional time that's taken from this school. And if we're interested in trying to improve academic outcomes, we've really got to pay attention to the time we're spending managing behaviors. The real message behind this is that context matters. If we're going to focus on behavioral issues, you really got to think big about the school-wide climate as well as the classroom climate. So the big idea is the following. 2 school psychologists called the problem really the issue of trying to build host environments that support all kids. A host environment is that experience you have when you walk down the hallways, if you walk through classrooms, as you visit schools. And the work that we do is trying to create host environments that have 4 or 5 very important characteristics. They need to be effective, they have to be efficient, they have to be relevant, they need to be durable, and they have to be scalable. And really the fast way to think about that is that we need to be thinking about schools that put in place interventions, both academic and behavioral, that really do produce the desired outcomes we want. That's what we mean by evidence-based practices. They really do produce those important outcomes. The second thing you need to know about what we do in the behavioral support world is whatever we ask schools to do, it's got to be efficient, which means that it's got to be doable. Real people have to be able to have the capacity to implement these practices, because if it's too difficult, too time-consuming, we're going to lose the impact of our interventions. The third piece is it's got to be relevant. What that really means is we've got to pay attention to the local culture, the local context. What is the language of the community? What are the cultural features of the families that send kids to our school? What are the cultural norms that make up the faculty that provide the instruction for our students? Fourth, these interventions that we put in place, these school-wide positive behavioral supports, need to be durable. They've got to last. What we find is that many interventions only have about a 6 to 8 month kind of time span on them, and then we start wandering away from accurate implementation. So we know it's very important that we stick with these interventions that we know have some likelihood of working. And the last one is scalable, which that really means is if it works in one classroom, can we take that effective intervention and move it to another classroom? Or if you're a district level person, which is what many of you in this audience are, can we take it from one school and transport it to another school? So when we think about host environments that work well, they have those 5 important features, which are they're effective, they're efficient, they're durable, they're relevant, and they're scalable. Now, if you take that logic a little further, let me get really more specific about the kinds of issues that we address in the work that we do in school-wide behavioral support. The bottom line is we really want to maximize academic engagement and maximize academic achievement. That's our real goal. We want kids to be able to read, to do their math, to be able to learn physics, to know the second language, to be able to do art and music and physical education and so forth. But to do that well, those 4 circles above have to be addressed. And that's what we do in our work at our center, as well as what this conversation is about. And that is, we've really got to decrease the amount of reactive management. The yelling, screaming, the punishers, the aversives that we use to try to stop misbehavior. Not that we shouldn't have consequences for rule violations, we need those. But when we overuse those, we create environments that are not positive host environments, but instead are negative host environments. The second critical feature about what we need to attend to if we're going to maximize our academic achievement is to make sure that we integrate academic and behavioral initiatives together. Good classroom management is not in isolation of good instructional management. They go together. And without having one, without having them combined, we fail to be able to produce maximum outcomes, which is why we want to blend these academic and behavioral initiatives together. The third thing that's important about getting to those maximizing academic engagement is making sure that we improve classroom and school-wide climates. If the climates in which kids have to learn are negative and aversive, we're going to minimize the kinds of academic outcomes that we have. And that's true of early elementary years as well as at the high school level. Now the last one, which is my area of real strong interest, or my area of specialty if I have one, is working with kids with serious emotional behavioral disorders. What do we do with kids who have significant challenges in the mental health world as well as in their behavioral success? To work with individual kids, we've got to make sure that the larger host environment is working well, which is part of the message that I was communicating earlier. Now, I want you to understand that before we start talking about what is behavioral support specifically, that most of the work that we do is linked to what we like to call evidence-based practices or research. We started out at our center looking at what does the research say about minimizing or decreasing or preventing violent behavior or antisocial behavior. And the research is very clear. If you want to create environments that work well, that are safe, that are respectful, that are responsible, it's really important that we think about these 5 or 6 characteristics. One is, you got to think big. The larger school climate has to be one that's positive. Second, you got to make sure that we invest in high levels of academic and behavioral success. When kids are academically successful, they're more likely to behave better, and our environments are more proactive. We also know that we've got to increase our emphasis on teaching social skills directly. Somehow we think that social skills are inherited or shaped over time, but in fact what we've learned is that you got to teach them just like you teach math, just like you teach physics. We also know from that literature about effective schools is that there's high levels of active supervision by the adults over kid behavior. And we know that that active supervision is positive, and we spend time acknowledging kids for doing things the right way. Very important feature about our schools that all staff need to be alert and be positively interacting with their students. The last 2 are dealing more with the adult side, which is the adults have to model what we want kids to be able to do. What we've learned across K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, year 12, is that the adults have to be able to demonstrate what we want the kids to be able to do in order for the kids to value those particular skills. And the last one is changing school environments is not an easy task. It's a multi-component, multi-year effort. It's not something you can do in a one-shot in-service or one professional development day. It's going to be something that takes multiple years with multiple elements that make up that effort. Moving forward a little bit further, this is where the meat of this conversation is about, which is really what is school-wide positive behavioral support. And I want to demystify it first for you, and to make sure that you understand that school-wide behavioral support is really a framework for making good decisions and problem solving around improving how we support kids on the academic and behavioral side. It's important to remember that school-wide behavioral support is not an intervention, it's not a curriculum, it's not a program. It's not something you can buy in a 3-ring binder or in a box. It's really a framework by which we do business. What is the business? It's about selecting, it's about implementing scientifically based interventions. Those behavioral interventions, those academic programs that we know to be effective. I would argue that we have 30 or 40 years of knowledge about what are effective interventions. What we don't have is a good science by which we organize those interventions in a way that maximizes their impact, which is really the framework that I'm trying to describe for you. So school-wide behavioral support is really a framework or a logic by which we do business around academic and behavioral programs. And that's an important message for you because it's about all students as well as individual kids. So somebody says, well, tell me a little bit more about how to define positive behavioral support. What I like to argue is that it's really about 4 elements that work together. It doesn't matter if you're working on a school problem or an issue, or if you're working on a community issue or a family issue or a project here at the University of Connecticut. It's really about organizing 4 critical pieces, and they are the following. The big circle is outcomes. Outcomes means what do we want kids to be able to learn? What do I want the project to be able to achieve? And it needs to be measurable. Because if we're not clear about what we want to achieve, it's hard to align our interventions. So somebody says, well, where do we get the outcome decisions from? That comes from data, and that's the second element. Data are used for decision making, which is the key element about what we do. I should be able to generate the data that validates the outcomes that we want to achieve and also directs us to the third element, which is practices. Those are the interventions that the kids experience. And those practices have to be able to document that they produce the outcomes that we want. Here in the United States, I'm very impressed by the number of schools that adopt practices because they're in a 3-ring binder and shrink-wrapped. And they don't align them with the critical outcomes that we're trying to achieve inside the schools. Around the world, we are struggling with trying to come up with the resources to do all the work that's required inside our schools. And what we've learned is that people are not using their minutes very efficiently because they don't align their practices with their outcomes and using their data to guide decisions. The fourth area, the last element that defines PBS or positive behavioral supports, are systems. And systems are what are the supports that the adults need to have to be able to implement the practice with high fidelity or accuracy. You can have the best evidence-based practice. You can have the best data to back up that decision for which practice, but if the adults aren't supported for accurate implementation, that practice will fail. So our framework around positive behavioral support is about trying to make sure people make decisions that consider all 4 elements, as opposed to just taking the intervention because it's something that's recommended. We need to make sure that the data support the decision for adopting that practice. So then you say, well, that's great to talk about an integrated set of elements, and those are all big words, outcomes, data, practice, and systems. But what are the real kind of practices or characteristics that make up school-wide positive behavioral support? There are really 5 or 6 main ones that drive what we do. Here in the United States, we've got this thing called response to intervention that's becoming very popular. It's another kind of framework for doing business. And positive behavioral support is an example of this response to intervention logic, which is made up of these 6 elements. And these are not unfamiliar to you. I just mentioned many of them already. But we emphasize these in the work that we do, which I'm going to describe in a few minutes. And that is, we really pay attention to building these evidence-based practices and organizing them in a continuum that really integrates these multiple initiatives together. The second critical piece that defines positive behavioral support in the work we do as far as the characteristics is that we're very prevention-oriented. And prevention-oriented means we're trying to catch misbehaviors before they occur. We're also trying to decrease the likelihood that kids will develop misrules about how they behave. The third critical element is continuous progress monitoring. We want to know on a weekly, daily basis how kids are performing behaviorally. We don't want to wait till the end of the semester to make decisions. We want to make decisions in a timely way. Fourth, we want to make sure we use our data to make good decisions and allow us to solve problems in an efficient and effective way. And then 2 more. One is we really emphasize this notion that you've got to teach what you want. If you want kids to manage their anger more appropriately, if you want to teach them, if you want them to problem solve, if you want them to be able to learn how to behave cooperatively, those are teachable skills that have to be encouraged. And the last one is we need to make sure that people are implementing interventions with high integrity and with high accountability. Frankly, much of the work I do around behavior is making sure that people implement with high integrity so that the interventions for which we know have some likelihood of success are going to have the impact that we want. So to go backwards, positive behavioral support's a framework. It's defined by the interaction of 4 critical elements: outcomes, data, practices, and systems. And then lastly, there are 6 critical features or characteristics that define the work that we do. We pay attention to accuracy, we pay attention to data, we try to prevent, we try to teach what we want, we make sure that we organize what we do along a continuum, which is where I'm going to jump to next, and then we make sure that we keep track of how kids are doing. So let's spend a little bit more time around this notion of a continuum. And many of you have seen this triangle before. The triangle really represents a prevention logic. But what it really does is organizes interventions in an efficient way that allows schools to make better use of their minutes. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because we use this prevention logic in our behavior work because it does a nice job of addressing who needs what. This is what I'd like you to think about. If you took all the kids inside your school, your district, let's just say 500 kids in a school, you throw them into the triangle. One thing that's very important is that all kids, left-hand side, are exposed to what we like to call a primary or tier 1 intervention. Every single kid needs to be exposed, for example, to a social skills program that promotes better behavior. Just like every single kid in a school should be exposed to a core early literacy program. Everybody needs to be exposed to something that we know has the best likelihood of preventing the development of problem behavior or promoting pro-social skills. Now, the literature is very clear. Even with a universal program, you will only capture 70 to 80 to 85% of your kids. In other words, they'll respond. There's about 15 to 20% of the kids who are not going to respond to a good school-wide social skills training program. Those 15 to 20% shift to the right-hand side. They're going to need what we call secondary or tier 2 interventions. They need something a little extra to be successful. What do those interventions look like? They're small group, they're higher adult monitoring, there's greater progress monitoring, and so forth. But the goal here is to have interventions that are linked to the school-wide so we can make decisions about who needs a little extra. Even if you do tier 2 interventions well, we've also learned that there are some kids who do not benefit from small group interventions or more minutes with the same intervention. They need what we call tier 3 or tertiary level interventions. Those are high intensity, individualized interventions. These are kids with significant emotional behavioral needs. These are kids with significant learning disabilities. These are kids who have significant math challenges. They need something much more intensive. Now, to go backwards, the logic here is we've got to do something for all kids. We need to do it really well so we know exactly which kids need more intensive interventions. We need to create host environments that provide supports for everybody so we know which kids need more. The problem is that in some schools, like that school with 5,100 referrals, their primary intervention was not very good. It was reactive punishment. And if that's the only intervention you have, your yellow and red zones are really big. And you can't provide that individualized assistance that's required because there are just too many kids. You've got to really invest in the larger host environment, which is really one of the priorities of our school-wide behavioral support work. So the message here is organize your interventions along that continuum. What do all kids get? What do you have for the kids who are non-responders, who need a little extra to be successful? And then what do you put in place for those kids who need more individualized assistance? That's what we mean by a continuum of behavioral support, both academically as behaviorally. What do all kids get? What do some kids get? And what do a few kids get? Now, what I want you to remember, though, is that 3-tiered logic is all about making sure that left-hand side works well. However, I'm not sure that all kids fit the 3-tiered logic well. And what we've gone to now is a more of a blended kind of continuum. And the way I want you to think about it is there's no such thing as a green kid or a red kid. There are kids who have green skills. The same kid could have red skills. Just to give you an example of how to think about this. My daughter, who's 16 years old, she's in high school. She does really well with writing. She's a wants to be a journalist. She's got a lot of creative writing. Her green zone's needs are met. She's a green zone performer for writing. But however, for science and math, she doesn't do as well with the core curriculum, and she needs a tutor to be successful. That's yellow zone. She needs a little extra to be successful with the core curriculum. There are some areas she really struggles. Some of the modules in math, for example, she needs individualized assistance. And that goes up into that red zone area where she needs one-on-one help. She believes that she's really good at basketball, which I think she is, being the bragging father that I am. And she's probably green zone performer in basketball. But she's probably only yellow zone performer for tennis, and she probably has no idea what to do if you gave her some other sports to kind of engage in. The idea here is that every single one of us have profiles. We're good at many things, we're so-so at others, and we need a lot for other things. I've worked with kids with some of the most significant emotional behavioral challenges, and one thing I've learned is that they do some things really well, and they do some things that are also not very well accepted in the environment. So we want to make sure we don't characterize kids as only one level, that we want to think about kids with respect to their strengths and weaknesses. So that ends our discussion about the continuum and the logic of making sure that everyone is considered for their individual strengths and weaknesses. Now, to shift a little bit, I want us to think about what are those evidence-based practices that fill in that continuum. And at our center, and what we do at the University of Connecticut, is think about our interventions as organized around 5 critical areas: school-wide, classroom, non-classroom, families, and students. And when you look at your materials, you'll find that we've tried to identify the smallest number of items that can have the biggest impact or the most effective influence in for our students in those environments. We try to make sure that these practices are evidence-based, and we also try to make sure that these are interventions that can be implemented by real individuals so that they have a durable effect. Now, if you look at your materials, you'll find that in each of those 5 areas, school-wide meaning all kids and all staff, classroom meaning the place where instruction goes on, non-classroom are our hallways, bathrooms, assemblies, field trips, parking lots, and so forth, cafeterias, and students, which means those kids who have more significant behavioral challenges, and families, which means how do we engage families to support our academic outcomes. Again, you'll find that we've tried to limit the interventions or strategies to the top 8 or 9. And again, what we've tried to do there is pick the ones that are the most doable, have demonstrated to be the most effective, and can be actually implemented by real individuals. So just as an example, if you look at non-classroom settings and you look at the research available for that area, there are 4 really important practices that are associated with non-classroom settings. And if every staff member was to actively supervise, give reminders, make sure we attend to kids when they're doing a good job, and if we make sure we teach the routines that are expected in those environments, we'll probably capture 80 to 90% of the students in that they'll be successful in those non-classroom environments. Same logic applies to the other 4 areas for individual students, classrooms, and non-classroom settings, school-wide as well as families. So I'll leave that for you to look at as a way to guide you in some of your own discussions, because the purpose of this presentation is to more focus on the bigger ideas than it is on those individual strategies. Now, having said that, though, if you go to the next slide, one thing that's important for us to remember is that we want to think about all these interventions along that continuum or that triangle. I'm going to go back to the 3-tiered triangle just because it's easier to talk about these interventions. And the logic here is that you want to think about placing those interventions in the 3 tiers. At the bottom layer, primary intervention or primary tier, is where we want to put those interventions that are in place for all kids, all staff, all students, all settings. And what we think about there is that if we do a good job with those interventions, we'll capture 80% of the students. The non-responders, the 15 to 20%, we need to go up to the next box up, which is called secondary tier prevention strategies. And for those kids, we give them a little extra time, a little more exposure to the interventions, a little bit extra attention. Of those kids, there's probably another 5% or so of kids who are not responsive to either primary or secondary tier interventions, and they require what's called tertiary level. And as I mentioned earlier, those are a few kids who need more individualized intensive strategies. So if you go to the next slide, you will see an example. This is strictly an example to guide us in our discussion of some interventions that might be placed in those three boxes. What's most important is not so much what those interventions are, but instead that they are linked together. that the interventions at the primary tier link logically to the next tier up, link logically to the more individualized interventions at the tertiary tier. And as you'll notice in the next click, there's an audit strategy or set of directions that we oftentimes walk people through. And what we ask people to do is look at what you currently have, identify what you'd really like to see as an outcome, what kids should really look like to be successful. How would you evaluate what you currently have in place and the outcomes and whether or not they're being effectively achieved or not. And also the next step, which is really about what can we eliminate based on the outcomes that are set up as priorities. And finally, what are the decision rules that move us up and down through that continuum. So what I'd like to do is finish off this discussion by summarizing a few things, and that is, this is really about prevention. It's really about catching kids in a framework that guides us in identifying best interventions or practices. And as I've argued throughout this presentation, it's not about the individual strategies as much as how we organize our resources to implement those strategies with high fidelity. And again, if you go back to the outcomes data, practices, and systems logic, and if you think about the PBIS features, that should guide you in building a continuum of interventions. So to finish off, I want you to think about what we've talked about is trying to achieve what a lot of businesses and other organizations try to achieve. If I think about our work at the University of Connecticut, if I think about what's going on at our center, what you'll notice is that successful organizations are those in which there's a common vision. We all know where we're headed. We have a common language by which we communicate with each other. And we also have a common set of experiences or routines that we follow on a daily basis and that are quite predictable. If I think about what we do here at the University of Connecticut, at our center, and our successful schools and our successful classrooms, you can define a successful host environment as one in which there's a common vision, a common language by which we talk, and a common set of experiences by which we do business. So I'd like to stop now with that formal part of the presentation and go forward to look at three questions that were presented earlier that people asked me to respond to. And I think these are three common questions that were presented across the other keynoters as well. The first question was, what are the three most important behavior management practices that we think all teachers and schools and so forth should have in place? And I'd probably argue that this is true of families as well as communities too. There are three that we think are the most important. One is, we think it's essential that you teach and that we encourage or acknowledge what we want kids to be able to do the right way. Yes, kids need to get some feedback about when they make behavioral errors, but what's most important is that their kids are taught and practice and are encouraged to do the right thing. And that means that we need to have frequent or regular interactions with those kids around what they're doing and acknowledge what they're up to. Second most important thing is that we need to actively supervise. And that means we need to know what kids are doing, and kids need to think that we know what they're doing even if we may not. That's true of family members as well as teachers, hallway monitors as well as administrators. We need to be actively engaged with our kids across all environments, and that supervision must be one that's active and overt. The third critical practice is making sure that we catch kids before they make mistakes, and that's prevention, or what we frequently call pre-corrects. Remember, a pre-correct is when we do things before the error happens because we know that it's going to happen. Many of us, for example, will set 2 alarm clocks because we sometimes sleep through the first one. Setting up that second alarm clock is really about arranging for our environments for success. It's like helping kids with difficult vocabulary words before we ask them to read a passage. It's catching kids at the door of the classroom before they walk in when we know that they may have a challenge because of something that's expected inside that environment. Pre-corrects are absolutely essential. Instead of waiting for the error to occur, we need to catch it before it happens. The second question that came up I need to respond to is, what are the 3 policy priorities that go along with those practices? If we're going to teach, actively supervise, and pre-correct, what kind of supports need to be in place at the policy level? There are 3 things that I think are important for us to consider. One is, as we've mentioned before, it's really important to invest in a continuum of evidence-based practices. Evidence-based means research-validated. Continuum means that those practices are organized in a way that makes sense for kids and staff members, and that continuum covers all students, not just those kids who are having challenges. Second major priority for policy is making sure that we invest in local expertise. It's fine to have outside persons like myself come in and provide professional development experiences, But what's really most important is making sure that the expertise is located within the organization or within the school. That's why much of the work we do is at the team level, because we want to give the team the capacity to take the content back and to maintain its implementation. Relying on expert expertise is dangerous because those outside expertise are not always available and oftentimes leave. The third policy priority is making sure that we think about integrating our behavioral supports along with our academic supports. As you all know, one of our best behavior management tools is good instruction. And one of our best behavior management tools is good instruction as well. At the same time, good instruction requires that there be good behavior management in place. So good policy priorities are making sure we invest in a continuum. Second, make sure we invest in professional development activities that establish local expertise. And third, making sure our policy statements invest in the integration of academic and behavior supports combined. The last question that I was asked to address are, what are the three priorities for action planning? That is, what do we do next? There are three things I think to think about. One is we really got to take advantage of what's available locally with respect to information. I'd really encourage all of us to examine our local data. What do our data say about our kids who are succeeding? And what do our data say about our kids who are struggling within our academic and behavioral supports? Second area is making sure that we think about establishing leadership teams that can take the content and bring it back to the school. And it's really important that the school administrator be an active participant in this leadership team. The third piece that goes along with data and a leadership structure is making sure that we engage in professional development activities that are ongoing and also commit to the long term. We know that organizations take 2 to 3 years to change, and we need to invest in professional development in that 2 to 3 year time frame. And it's most important that we focus on high fidelity implementation. That is, we focus on accurate implementation of these practices. The practices are only as good as the extent to which we implement with high accuracy and that we have a majority of the staff investing. Evidence-based practices are effective because they are evidence-based, but they are not going to be effective if we don't implement with high integrity. So those three areas around behavior management practices, priorities, and action planning are good ways to finish up this conversation. And what I'd like to remind people is that it's really about prevention. It's really about encouraging kids to do what we want them to do as opposed to reacting to what they do incorrectly. And I think if we think about the systems variables at the same time as we think about evidence-based practices, we'll have a greater chance of improving our academic outcomes. So again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to present. I know the video conferencing kind of format is a little bit challenging for some, but I think the important thing is to try to get the ideas out in front of you. If you want access to some of these materials, please go to pbis.org or cber.org, and you can not only see this presentation, but the handouts will also be available to you, as well as additional material to support this presentation. So again, I want to thank you, and I hope you have a good time for the rest of your conference, and I appreciate this opportunity to present to you. Thank you very much.